Hello and welcome to Newspeak, the New Culture Forum's weekly look at the political agenda. As you can see, Emma's not with us this week. I'm afraid you got me. Emma is off on a well-deserved break somewhere in Greece, but we have three guests, as usual. Philip Kiszely, who is Senior Fellow at the NCF and Lecturer at Leeds University, Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, Senior Fellow, and also Royal Commentator that you must be seeing quite a lot on GB News at the moment. And a very special guest, John O'Sullivan, who is Director of the Danube Institute. He's been on the channel a number of times before. John is, I'm afraid I hope you don't mind me saying so, an elder statesman of conservatism, if you like. He was an advisor to Margaret Thatcher and also editor of the National Review. Very pleased to see him here on a visit to London. Thank you very, very much, John. We're going to start this week. We're going to do basically two issues, and they were written about in different places in the media. First of all, there is as you probably have seen, the growing situation where there is a huge disparity between what the police are doing vis-à-vis crime and what they're doing, if you like, vis-à-vis the woke agenda. And there's a piece written by Paul Embry in Spiked Online about that. And connected to that, also, we are going to be looking at what we do about what is known as the Blob, i.e. that is the political elite, the cultural elite, the civil service elite. Henry Hill wrote a very good piece about this in Capex, which is an online journalism site. But these are very, very, very much issues of the moment. Can I start actually asking you, Rafe, when it comes to the police, we've seen some really nasty clips, haven't we, on social media recently? There was a woman being mugged. We've seen in Knightsbridge, I believe. We've seen kids ransacking a McDonald's in Nottingham. And yet there is this sort of sense in which the police are entirely absent.
Yes. I mean, when Robert Peel set up the police force, one of the principles that he outlined was to say that it's not the number of arrests that counts, it's the reduction in crime, it's the lack of crime. And this absence of the police that we're having, who seem far more concerned about policing online conduct rather than the conduct on our streets, is very disturbing. And if you look at the scenes, I mean, absolutely shocking scenes. You almost think that the barbarians are already inside the gates, and this is really the end of Western civilization. We're sort of moving back from our peak into a sort of 18th century London, when you were codged over the head in dark corners. Absolutely shocking scenes, and there seems to be a complete dereliction of duty by the police, who are very visible when they choose to be visible, such that at, for example, pride parades, we're seeing very much the police choosing to appear at those things. Funnily enough, not being seen at Corpus Christi processions for some reason, and yet it's this idea that the police are catering to a certain portion of the population. And when Peel set out his principles, it was about being uniformly impartial at all times, enforcing the law without fear nor favour. And yes, we do have uniquely in Britain and the Commonwealth policing by consent. We do have police who are the public in uniform, but it seems as if they have forgotten the ability to actually discern between what is their own personal belief and their general rule and duty of enforcing the law.
And that idea of uniform made me think about the two images which really struck me this week. One was the children running riot in McDonald's and looting McDonald's and not bothering to cover their faces because they knew that there's going to be no comeback for this. They can just do it and get away with it. And the other one, juxtaposed to that, compared to that, is the image of the policeman in red high heels. And for me, the juxtaposition of those two images really sums up where we are. It's almost as if I'm thinking about the government as well, actually. It's almost as if it's like a house that's going through divorce. It's nobody cares anymore and anybody can do anything they want. People aren't doing what they're supposed to do. And of course, children will just take that and run riot, and that's what's happened in Nottingham.
I mean, John, do you think that the police actually have given up on the whole idea of, punishing crime, as it were, or detecting or preventing crime? Do you think they've actually given up on that?
Well, statistically speaking, they certainly have. because the solution rate is about 1%, between 1 and 2% of crimes, and that applies to very serious crimes like rape, for example. So the other thing which is interesting is they coming to this country. I'm not living here. And of course, people like us are always talking in terms of the failure of bureaucracy of government and so on. But I'm finding, just talking to people as I go about London and having coffee here and a drink and so on, is that there is a widespread sense of social crisis, that nothing seems to work, and that is obviously worse in relation to the police than others, because obviously the consequences of not having police or effective police are much greater, and even when they actually occur, you're more nervous as a result. So I do think there is this pervasive sense of things fall apart, everything's collapsing, you can't rely on anything, and it doesn't actually stop with regular policing and so on. I think among lawyers, you know, get younger lawyers who basically agitate within their groups that certain people should not be assisted by them. Because they hold views which the young lawyers don't approve of. That's a very, very serious breakdown in professionalism, and I don't believe it would have happened anything like this way even a few years ago. But there is you have a sense of all the social bonds, including restraints, which we used to feel, gradually atrophying.
I mean, it's a good point you make about young lawyers, because I think it's 1/3 of the current police force are new recruits who have been brought on board within the last 5 years, and that's a shockingly high rate. First of all, we know that now, of course, it's a requirement for new recruits to have gone through the graduate process, so they are naturally exposed to woke ideology in universities, as is the want for any student these days. So they're being churned out with these ideological predispositions already. They're going into a police force where they lack the experience, and this is one of the reasons so few crimes are being solved, because you have young detectives who simply don't have the experience to know how to properly investigate crimes.
Isn't it apparently something like some extraordinary statistic, like is it 80% of officers have not even made an arrest or something this year?
But there's something else as well, and it's evident in the language, and I get completely what you say about the young police officers, but the senior police officers as well. So I'm thinking about the stabbing murder of the little girl in Liverpool. She was about 8 or 9, and she was stabbed in the chest, and she died. And the press release from the police was, you know, this is a crime against our community, us, we, and the police were positioning themselves as victims. Do you know what I mean? Because they're not actually outside of what's going on and in control of it or preventing it. It's happening to them, and they talk as though they're victims. I don't want the police to be victims, because the victims aren't going to solve the crimes. I want the police to be stood outside of it and imposing themselves on what's going on. And the language, as we always say, the language is really important. It shows us their positionality.
Well, there's another element of the way the police talk about all of these things and themselves, and it's this, that they are a member of a certain social group. I mean, and I would say the foreman class, the people who transmit the instructions, the values of from the top of society down to the rest of us. And when we were all young, those values were old-fashioned, solid, safe, conservative values. Respectability itself, although open to religious criticism as an ideal, nonetheless was what was valued. And now they are transmitting very different values and ideas to the rest of society. You get the feeling, if you're stopped by the police, I think a lot of people have said this kind of thing to me in the last few days. I was in Liverpool, by the way, where I used to live. A lot of people have said, if a policeman stops you now, you think he's going to ask you about gender or race or sex, not about what happened down there. Did you see anything?
Hello. Yeah, a trans woman is a trans woman.
And this is, first of all, a bad thing in itself. What makes it worse is that the values and ideas they're transmitting are woke values, because it's a different establishment.
But what is it sort of actually today? You know, you're talking about them being seeing themselves as victims. There's a chief superintendent, I think, just a random one, got onto Twitter, and he's complaining because the police were at some pride thing in Lincolnshire where they were dancing with the pride thing, and there's been a bit of a hoo-ha about this, and he's gone saying, I think what they did was great. I'm sick of being used as a football in your culture war.
It's the
and
victim thing, isn't
and
it?
you sort of think, but you're absolutely propagating this thing.
He's the centre forward in the culture
Exactly.
But the problem is they're shutting Lincoln Town Centre down on a Saturday night, aren't they? Because it's dangerous. Yeah, that's the other part of the story. So there's lots of crime going on, and it's not a safe environment.
Yeah.
But they're still dancing and they're still wearing their red shoes.
And of course, to have authority, the authority of the police is based upon respect. The public have to have respect for the police, and it's very hard to have respect for somebody wearing a rainbow helmet and red high heels. And
It depends on the context.
And of course, I think it's in Manchester now that they've actually seen an improvement in public attitudes towards the police, because they've told them to have a shave, trim your beards, smarten up your dress. Because I don't know if anyone else has noticed this, but over the last 20 years, the state of police dress has gone downhill so dramatically. They wear these terrible white shirts which are hanging out half the time, these sort of waistcoat things, as opposed to the old black coats, and it's hardly Dixon off Dock Green.
And also baseball caps and
baseball caps, and it's very lovely. And of course, these unkempt beards, these beards going down like troll-like to their belly buttons, and you sort of think, if I was a robber, I would just pull on your beard in a fight. It's not a very health and safety issue either, but it's all about respect ultimately, and it's very hard to respect these institutions now.
Do you think? What do you think has actually happened? Therefore, what has happened to the people? Because Peter Hitchens has written about this, past 30, 40 years, puts it all down to various reforms in the 1960s when the whole thing changed and the mob became off the beat, essentially, and became reactive. But this is entirely new, isn't it? This is as though they have actually sort of shunned what you might call traditional crime in favour of a social agenda.
It feels like they've just given up on it. They've just said, oh well, we can't do it. It's too much. So and it's not important. So they can't do it. It's not important, and we feel that these other issues are, because these other issues are important to the kinds of people, the establishment. You called them the new establishment, John, didn't you? And that's precisely what they are. They're important to the new establishment, and we are we are part of that new establishment.
But even a conservative government,
we are the foot soldiers to that new establishment.
But even a conservative government is pushing an online safety bill, which you can all understand concern about the internet. I share that. But nonetheless, to have in the bill something, a category of actions which are legal but offensive, that's legal but dangerous, I think, is an absurdity. And it's one of the things which is happening here is that the police are becoming the enforcers of things which aren't crimes. The whole argument over Harry Miller was over something in which they were recording something as a hate crime incident, even though it wasn't a crime. They still have not agreed to, they still have not followed the court's instructions not to do this. And the result is that people are beginning to feel that the police are not even obeying the courts, which is to say they are now the free-floating agents of a kind of social revolution. And the very fact that you mentioned, you have to have a degree, I mean, that is a form of credentialism, which is bad in itself, but also means that a whole class of people who might make very good policemen don't get the chance to come into it.
It's interesting, I find now I don't mind admitting, I feel hostile to the police. Now, when someone like me, law-abiding, late middle-aged guy starts to kind of feel hostile to me, there's something very, very wrong, I think. But you can also conversely look at the people who really praise them, and they're all the people who would never have praised them in the 1980s and 1990s. It tells you something, I think.
Well, it's obvious to say, but it's ideological, isn't it? You know, if the worst crime you could commit is to use the wrong pronouns, and when crimes are actually going on, like looting, and there is just no comeback on any of that kind of thing, the ideology's won, hasn't it? You know, the ideology's taken over.
Well, I mean, that really brings us quite nicely on, because it is one and the same, really, in a way. I was struck by this piece by Henry Hill in CapX, in which he talks about the fact that basically the need has come to stop the leftward drift of the establishment, to actually be more political and to put in people in positions in the quangocracy sympathetic to not just us, but I would say the majority of people. I mean, you've read the piece, haven't you, actually? It's based around a report, isn't it, actually?
Well, the Institute of Government is a allegedly non-partisan think tank, but it's really a mouthpiece for the civil service in terms of the body that makes it up and so forth. And so there is a vested interest there, and it essentially says that politicians should be removed from the appointments process for quangos and other bodies, and that they should ultimately rest in the hands of civil servants and independent panels. But of course, anyone who's familiar with Yes Minister knows the skullduggery that will be put in place if you hand things over to the civil service, who essentially will give ultimately a minister at the end of the day a short list of candidates, all of whom basically reflect the same opinion and the same viewpoint. Yeah. Now, of course, what happened was when Tony Blair came into power, you did have a night of the long knives, and you had a complete hollowing out of our institutions, and cuckoos were placed in the nests, people who had absolutely no connection to the people who founded those institutions, no sharing of the values and beliefs of generations of people who had come before, but they've now become the de facto establishment. You know, and remarkably, since David Cameron came to power in 2010, you know, most of these appointments are still announced in The Guardian, for example. You know, this is the practices of Blair haven't changed, and you're still seeing the systemic takeover of our institutions by the left, even over the past decade. And the great hope when Dominic Cummings came in was that he wanted to tackle the civil service. This was one of the key things that I was excited about with Boris Johnson taking over, was that I knew that behind Boris, the puppet, was the puppet master who had a clear plan and policy to try to reverse the long march over the foreseeable 10 years of a Tory party elected with an 80-seat majority. There was at least a 2-term government guaranteed, if not a 3-term government guaranteed, with that sort of thing. But unfortunately, everything got derailed by COVID and Boris's personality, and Marie Antoinette pushed out Dominic. That never happened to take place. We can only hope that with the election of a new Prime Minister, this will be looked at again, because as it stands, yes, we do have an overtly political civil service and institutional elite, but it simply doesn't have the political colours that we want.
Well, I wouldn't say just we want. I'd say that the majority of the country, actually. I mean, you know, for example, this week I was speaking to the head of the campaign Restore Trust. It's a very similar situation in the National Trust. It's exactly the same as what we're talking about. Basically subverting the actual aims of the institution. I mean, Rafe just said there, John, about let's hope it happens when we've got a new leader. What are the chances?
Well, I don't think the chances are very good, because in the case of the civil service, the people they choose will always be people who are on the centre left, not because they're trying to push things in that direction. It's simply they're the sort of obvious people. Friends of mine have been sitting on those kind of committees that select people for honours lists in the past, and they have very funny dinner party horror stories about this, in which it's perfectly plain that the people who are going to get honours for the arts, for example, will not represent popular writers, will not even there won't be many playwrights who represent centre views, let alone right-wing ones. It just won't happen unless they're people from the dim and distant past being revived. So there is a kind of the world of the civil service and the wider establishment is full of people who do not think, for example, that if they're in the British Council, that the British Council is there to promote the idea of Britain as a great cultural superpower which has done wonderful things for culture. No, it's riddled with doubt and self-guilt. And that's true across the board in these kind of conversations. And that's why, in a sense, you have to have, as Rafe said, and I completely agree, you have to have the Conservatives coming in and saying, we're going to actually close 1, 2, 3, 4 and replace them by new institutions which will have a slightly different prospectus. And that is going to cause the most awful row, and the conditions economically and in other ways for winning that battle do not look very good. On the other hand, the labour unions may come to our assistance and create and then take the blame for a lot of the things that are going wrong. So you can never be totally despairing. But what you do have at the moment is a leadership class that is basically not supportive of the institutions it leads.
And we saw the outcry that we had when, for example, Paul Dacre they tried to put Paul Dacre in, former editor of the Daily Mail, to Ofcom, or when Charles Moore was touted as a possible BBC Director General, and you saw the Blob in action there.
But if you look at things like Arts Council England, for example, then that's just completely closed off.
Would you get rid of it, Arts Council?
Yes. I would. I'd just get rid of it. That's one particular arm's length organisation that is just, as we said before, completely and utterly ideological. It stands in between people and artistic endeavour, and it's just there purely for the people who run it.
I think it is. The interesting thing about the Arts Council, it was never meant to be permanent. It's quite a good case study. It was meant to fade out. It wasn't going to be needed. But of course it grew and grew. I think it's getting on for $1 billion now, I think in the budget. Yeah. But it's entirely about social engineering.
Well, yeah, I mean, they produced a document a few years ago, about 10 years ago now. It's called Great Art for Everyone, that literally just read like the Communist Manifesto.
Right. What would you actually get rid of? What would be at top of your list? Crime goes. John.
Well, I would. The British Council would be certainly one, and I'd agree with the Arts Council. And I think it's not a difficult thing to do in one sense. That is to say, you simply establish a body which has got some of the same responsibilities with a different set of instructions. You can't do it with the existing personnel because they've all been recruited because they sympathise with the current mission. And obviously, if people who read The Guardian want to have their own Arts Council, well, this time they can be the ones who have to fund it privately. But remember, you're taking on the Blob. You're taking on an enormously powerful set of institutions, and I don't think you can be optimistic about an early victory. In my view, this is a sort of 30-year struggle.
Do you think that your average Tory MP even gets what we're talking about? Do you think they see it in this way?
Well, there's some hope when you see organisations like the Common Sense Group, right, under John Hayes. But what I find amazing is that there aren't more people thinking like that. There was one MP, for example, just last week who spoke out about the real problem with immigration isn't channel crossings, but the fact that the Tory party has seen legal migration go to unparalleled heights. And you think, well, why has it taken you so long to realise this? And why aren't there others like you speaking out? What's happened to the Tory party when those clear issues, crime, immigration, and the left institutional takeover have become minority issues or become eccentric issues within the Tory party?
Isn't one of the most alarming things that's happened recently that Penny Mordaunt got a third of Tory MPs supporting her for the final two? And had she won, by the way, and it was her versus Rishi, she might actually have ended up as leader of the Conservative Party. But as far as I can see, she's very strongly opposed on principle to conservatism.
Anything that's conservative at all.
Well, as was Liz Truss until very recently, and perhaps still is, secretly.
But I suppose it just thinking about the Blob, that's a really good example, because we don't necessarily think about civil servants or quangos, do we? We tend to think about the universities or the media or museums and stuff. So and that's, it's almost like an iceberg, isn't it, in a way? So we see the wokery on the surface, and then we've got all of this murky stuff down here where the real power is, and most people don't really think about that. And when I do think about that, it actually does make me feel quite depressed.
Yes. John's quite right. It is a long-term process.
Yeah, it's a generational thing.
It took Tony Blair 10 years to do it. And what I think is the greatest sadness of this modern age is the fact that we could have had 20 years of conservatism. That would have been enough to actually make whole-scale change. We're halfway through, hopefully, that 20-year period, and nothing at all has been done.
Do you know, it's worth just referencing that all these quangos together, I think they control something like 200 billion.
Yeah.
200 billion.
That just makes the point, doesn't it? You know, that's
it's quite extraordinary. So we're talking about a long-term thing. In the meantime, life goes on, and there's a piece as well I wanted to end on, actually, which is by Frank Furedi, and it's talking about the need for discipline in schools. Can you just fill us in on this, actually?
This is a really good piece, and I think anybody who's interested in education and schools particularly, we've just been talking about children running riot in McDonald's. You know, this is what you get if you don't instill discipline in schools, and the piece is essentially championing the idea of discipline. So he's talking about a school, he lives in Kent, Faversham in Kent, and he's talking about a school that's near him. This was a school that was in special measures. It was absolutely on the floor. It's turned round and it's getting brilliant grades now. Half the students are getting A's, A stars, and all the rest of it. Ofsted, however, think the school is dreadful. Even though it's one of the highest achieving schools in the country, Ofsted think it's dreadful. And the reason they think it's dreadful is because the school is implementing this discipline regime where students actually have to sit up straight, they have to dress properly, they have to speak in full sentences. And the reason they've done so well is because of this discipline. But some of the pupils have said to Ofsted inspectors that they feel oppressed by it. And so Ofsted have downgraded the school even though it's doing brilliantly.
Wouldn't they actually almost on principle take against it anyway? Yeah. A little bit in the same way they do. They've got it in for Catherine Burblesing because of her school and the extraordinary success again. Ultra traditional. I mean, this is Frank Furedi. This is one of his sort of subjects, isn't it? Because he wrote a book called The Need for Borders, which is about actually the need for boundaries, really, and how this is incredibly important for freedom. I mean, would you go along with that, Rafe? I mean, do you think, you know, because it's very easy when we're sitting here and people look in and think, look, you know, these are duffers going on about all they need is a good smack or something, and it's not really about that, is it?
No, well, all the studies have shown that just treating children with love, warmth and kindness, but clear boundaries and rules that must be followed, leads to the most healthy, productive and engaged children who become productive members of society, as opposed to the opposite, the lack of discipline we're seeing now. And it's almost as if entitlement has become the watchword of the day, and there's been a loss of deference and a loss of shame that has come with it. And it's the lack of deference and the lack of shame that lies at the heart of these issues, as well as these children running amok in McDonald's and elsewhere. You know, the idea when a teacher enters the classroom, and when I was at school we all stood up automatically. Does that happen any longer? No. But you know, calling teachers by their first name.
And the idea that everything is framed in a therapeutic gobbledygook, you know, psychobabble as well. And so Frank Furedi, again, warned about this years and years ago. He wrote a book about the Therapy Society. And Dennis Hayes wrote a book called The Dangers of a Therapeutic Education. I'm talking 15 years ago here. And children know, don't they? They know which words to use if they want their own way. So children know if they say, I feel oppressed, then, you know, the useful idiots will listen, and then they can just go and run riot and do whatever they want, you know. And because the useful idiots think children know best about everything, these are the people who are encouraging 6-year-olds and 8-year-olds to think about their gender. So I think it's a broader thing, and we've talked about this idea of victimhood, and we talked about the police framing themselves as being victims. It's all connected, isn't it? And it's all part of this society, this shift in society that we need to change.
In fact, the other day I read a passage in Dickens in which he's complaining. We think of Dickens as a sentimental sort of guy. He's complaining that old lags and criminals are very quick to latch on to the latest idea which would help them. And he said if it became thought that brass buttons had some connection with crime, they'd be saying it was brass buttons that got me here, Garfield. And the problem we're facing in all of these questions we discussed today is the inversion of values.
Yes.
Respectability is now a bad thing. You're probably hypocritical, snobbish, maybe racist. Lack of respectability, well, that demonstrates a large, open, romantic attitude to life. So there's, whenever you look at the problems we're facing, we face the fact that what we could normally we talk to each other and rely on sympathy for one set of ideas, the people in charge of us no longer share those ideas, and they're unsympathetic to us.
And the disappearance of privacy as well, the disappearance of the private space. So now everybody feels as though they've got to just parade all of their private stupidity, and that's somehow virtuous, where there used to be, you know, your public self and your private self, and they were two completely different things. But the disintegration of that, I think, feeds into precisely what you're saying, John.
Can I say one interesting point about this is, I would say that it's all, as you say, respectability is now seen as a bad thing. But you know, it's rather like, you know, we used to mock Hyacinth Bouquet, you know, and the sort of people who aspired and got things wrong, and it's a staple of English comedy. But in a way, there was something sort of about that. The motive in an odd way was not a bad one. It was about bettering in a way. I mean, it's very easy. Of course, she was a snob and all the rest of it. But I mean, in trying to do, it was sort of an acknowledgement that there was something good about knowing this or that. That seems to have entirely gone. But when it comes to schools, interestingly, yes, we all used to get up in the morning and we would all wear uniforms. That wasn't just about authority, actually. The reason behind that is the reason that children all get up is that it brings a class together. It wasn't just out of this sort of innate respect for the teacher. And uniforms were there so that rich kids wouldn't look any different to poor kids.
And you're preparing yourself. You're dressing up to go and be a learner. You're going to be a pupil, and that's different from hanging around in your bedroom or kicking a ball down the street with your mates. You're being something else. You know, you're being this public persona as opposed to the private persona, and I think that's really important.
Carlson, you're living in Hungary. What's the school situation there like? I mean, would they have teachers being frightened to face kids?
I don't think so, though I have to say my personal connection with the schools in Hungary is pretty non-existent, so I couldn't really answer that. But I do think there is a sense of order and stability and safety in Budapest in a way that has vanished from many West European cities. There is no doubt about that. My wife, when she returns home from a dinner with her women friends, they just stroll through the middle of the city, never worry about anything. And we read very little accounts of crime affecting either tourists or local people.
Yes. Well, I'm afraid that's not the case here. And even though, you know, you can say there's some hyperbole, do you not sense a kind of, not exactly a precipice, but there's an edginess in the air?
I think that's why I made the point at the beginning about it feels like we're in a household where the divorced parents don't care about anything anymore. That, you know what I mean? It does feel like there's an edginess. It feels like there's an anarchy, and I think that's because we don't really have a functioning government at the moment. We are in a kind of liminal space, aren't we? And maybe things will get better. It's a hot summer, and all of those things, all of the ingredients.
You're sounding like Sadiq Khan.
I know. I'm not making excuses though, but all of the ingredients are there, aren't they? And it's very worrying. Unlike Sadiq Khan, who doesn't seem to give a toss, I find it very worrying.
But let me ask you, because you're all here and I'm not, but my impression is that the COVID had a transforming effect in a way that's really quite damaging, because the Tories came in, they seemed to have some kind of new consistent policy which might have worked, who knows, but Boris personally in a sense, had the stuffing knocked out of him by COVID. He found that all of the things that he would, all his normal political instincts had to be reversed. He struggled a bit against this, it's true, but nonetheless, for practical purposes, he was defeated. That we were governed by the Blob, actually, more or less, with the cabinet acting as intermediaries. That government then, Boris's, in a sense, failure to follow through, bled into every other policy. And it's not just a question, I think, that he was net zero, but across the board, the government seemed to lose any sense of direction, which I think David Frost rightly pointed out. And it seems to me that getting back that kind of sense that there are things we have to do. Well, the country's going to hell in a handbasket across the board, and we have to have a sense that whoever comes in has an overall sense and an overall determination to impose reasonable state authority in a way that has not been happening in all of the cases we've been talking about today.
Don't you sort of feel slightly, I mean, as you were an advisor to Margaret Thatcher, don't you feel that we're back to square one a bit, John? I mean, seriously, it feels like almost that was
it's almost it's a summer of discontent, isn't it?
But it's an aberration. That everywhere you look, as you just said, things are not working, and that is a feeling from the 70s, particularly the 70s. Admittedly, more overtly economic than now, but it's almost like we went on a great sort of we went in a great direction, which we've been pulled back to this decline.
Well, that's perfectly true, and the same thing had happened before. I mean, maybe that's what is true of political life in a general thing. You have to fight the same battles again and again. But in this case, it's a bit worse than that, because at the current time, a lot of conservatives have begun to say, well, we don't really want to have fiscal responsibility. We think that's kind of, it's not there, not important to us anymore. We need these other things. And yet, when it comes down to it, you cannot achieve anything unless you have a fiscal sanity, unless you have a tight budgetary policy, unless you're not drowning in debt and over expenditure. And until we face up to that reality, which we did to some extent under Cameron. I mean, in that area they did act bravely. I know it's unpopular to say so now, but I think they did. But on the other hand, they wouldn't take on the cultural battles at all, and that is in the end sunk them and maybe us.
Well, I think on that note, actually, the next time we meet, will there be a new Prime Minister? I think the 5th of September, and we will see whether in fact they look at cultural aspects of our society at all. Let's hope they do.
Let's not hold our breath, though.
No, okay. Thank you very much, John. Thank you, Rafe. Thank you, Philip. That's it for Newspeak this week. Emma still won't be back next time. I know that will cause a pain to a lot of you, but anyway, we shall see you next time. Thanks very much. Bye-bye. Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.